Good morning, friends. Today I'd like to speak a bit more about something I mentioned in yesterday's service, actually before we even got to the message. Because for our opening song, what we call our song of adoration, we sang the old-time hymn, Victory in Jesus. And I took a moment to remind us that when we got to the second to the last line of the song, as we reached the climax, we were going to hold the word victory. We're going to hold that word out for emphasis. And I mentioned that, of course, specifically so that people weren't surprised by it, but also to give an opportunity to talk about how we sing our songs in worship. Because, again, we don't sing as a corporate body of believers simply to check a religious duty off the list. You know, the Bible has psalms in it, and we're told in them to sing to the Lord and praise Him. So, yeah, I guess our worship services need to include songs. Now, on the one hand, we really ought to sing to the Lord because it is commanded in the scriptures. But is that the only reason we sing, out of mere obligation? Well, I certainly hope not. Rather, we sing because music and song provide a way for us to express our faith, our love, our joy, our submission, our thanksgiving to the Lord in a special way. And music is far from the only way we can do this. It's far from the only way we can express ourselves to the Lord. It's not the only way we worship. In fact, I want to make this very clear that it is wrong and cringeworthy if ever a pastor or a worship leader acts as if the congregation hasn't actually begun worshiping the Lord until they start singing. Because in truth, we ought to be worshiping, at least in terms of talking about the corporate worship, we ought to be worshiping the moment we silence our hearts before the Lord, preparing ourselves to enter His presence as a body of believers. But singing as a body of believers is indeed a valuable and fundamental part of that corporate worship. And music is fundamentally emotive, has to do with our emotions, and expressive. And while we do caution regularly, and I'll caution again right now against doing what we do purely for the emotion and feeling of it, we would do our service to and worship unto the Lord a great disservice if we try to take the emotion and feeling out of our worship. And let me try to explain why this is and kind of unpack this a bit, because in Psalm 37:4 we read, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart." Now, this passage is not merely talking about musical worship, far from it, but it does have application there. And as we've mentioned this verse before, we've emphasized the fact that you can't just take the second part and forget about the first part. This is not a universal promise that you can demand that God give you the desires of your heart, no matter what those desires might be. Because, again, that first part of the verse puts an important qualifier to that. If what you desire in your heart is to delight yourself in the Lord, then you most assuredly have God's promise that He will grant you that desire of your heart. And as it comes to worshiping in music or whatever, shouldn't the greatest desire of our heart, what brings us delight and happiness and satisfaction and joy, shouldn't that be worshiping the God who saved us? After all, again, in whatever form it will take, whether in song or in service, in creative works to His glory or simple spoken praise, worshiping God is going to be our vocation for the duration of our eternal lives. So I really hope that that's what we delight ourselves in. And again, even as I mentioned that list of possible activities in eternity, singing is far from the only way that we worship God. But when we think of singing in particular, and the nature of song, the expressiveness of singing to the Lord, doesn't it make sense then that if we are satisfying a desire of our heart while we worship God in song, then that would produce a certain emotive response in us as we do it? Because if our desire is to worship God, and so we worship God in song, then won't the experience of having the desire of our heart fulfilled in that worship, won't that produce satisfaction and joy, contentment and peace, passion and gratitude in us as we sing? And should not those experiences, those results, those emotions, should those not be reflected in how we sing? And so sometimes that's going to lead us to sing in exuberance, to sing loudly, shouting to the Lord, making a joyful noise unto the Lord. Other times it's going to mean we sing with almost a quiet passion, a quiet intensity as we consider the words that we sing, the doctrines that we ponder as we sing, the deep contemplations of who God is and what he's done for his people as we sing about him. And therefore, various songs will sound and, yes, feel different. The exuberant song versus the more somber song, which is no less worshipful, no less an expression of our passion for the Lord when it's more that quiet intensity, because it's fulfilling our desire to worship God in that way. Now, with all this in mind, let me tell you a quick story to maybe exemplify some of this. Some years ago, I was quite a few years ago actually, I went to a pastor's conference on preaching, and so it was all pastors there. Fairly large sanctuary, some 300, between 300 and 400 pastors in attendance, and there was a few pastors' wives in the room, but the vast majority of voices singing were men. Okay. And we'd have a session, a time of teaching, and then we'd sing a couple of songs. And it was awesome, because it's not very often you hear just men singing. And it was a wonderful time to worship God in song alongside so many other passionate brothers. And the music was simple. It was a father and son team playing the piano and an acoustic guitar. Nothing flashy, nothing over the top, but they certainly played well. But here's the thing. We sang many different songs, and as I mentioned already, it was fantastic singing with so many fellow pastors. But then, as we began a new song, and they didn't announce what the song was, but we all knew right away, because in the opening, the introductory melody line that the piano and the guitar played together, we knew immediately it was the hymn. It is well with my soul. And in that first introductory line, before we even sang a word of that song, it's like the air changed in that room. And when those men started to sing that song, it was overwhelming. Because if you're familiar, of course, that song deals with both the joy of salvation as well as the deep pain of suffering. Concluding, of course, with each verse with, regardless of the joy or the pain, it is well with my soul. And singing that hymn with that message alongside all those other men who were pastors, who had seen and experienced so much in their ministries. Yes, the joys, but also just so much pain in their own lives, pain from the people in their congregation that they had to help shoulder and bear with them on. And I was still early in my ministry at that point, but I had experienced enough myself that I could relate to the rest of those men, and to declare to the Lord, as one body of men, as one body of his men, even in all of that, it is well with our souls. And friends, I cannot express to you what was actually expressed in that room by those men to the Lord that day. And I don't think any of us actually wanted that song to end. I don't think anyone would have complained if the instrumentalist had just started it up again from the beginning. But the song ended, and the room just went silent. And the man who was clearly supposed to initiate the next session, it was like he didn't want to say anything. He didn't want to break that silence after the song, and no one was eager for him to. No one really wanted to let that moment go, because it was such a deep expression of faith and trust in the Lord, mixed with the knowledge of the deep sorrows that we had shared together, as well as the incredible joys of being one of God's ministers. And of course, the conference did have to continue, but I will never forget that song, nor singing it with all those fellow pastors. But even as I relate that story to you, here's the problem with that experience. Because I could, in light of having experienced that. I could go to the next conference just hoping for something like that to happen again, to get that experience back. I could go so eager to feel that way again because it felt so good and so comforting and so satisfying and so peaceful. It was one of the most real experiences of my life. But the thing is that it felt like that, not because we went into that song looking for those feelings, but because those men sang that song out of a deep reverence for and trust in the sovereign God who would keep us and sustain us through all the trials of ministry. And that we could say honestly and genuinely from the deepest places of our hearts, it is well with my soul. The reason it felt so good was because it was an honest and genuine expression of our worship of our sovereign Lord in whom we trusted. And that is what we must always remember, particularly when it comes to musical worship, because the desires of our hearts that will be satisfied is to take our delight not in the feelings, not in that experience, but in the Lord himself, to worship him. And yes, as we genuinely worship him, those experiences and those expressions of emotions will become part of that worship. And there's nothing wrong with that. And they can lead us to even further joy as we worship the Lord. But as soon as we start chasing those feelings, as soon as they become the goal, we're no longer worshiping God. Rather, we're doing the opposite, for we've made an idol of the emotional experience itself. And friends, it's startling how quickly we can go from true worship to idolatry. But it can happen, and it does happen so often. But when we purposefully keep these things in mind, the truths revolving around the desire that we ought to have for the Lord, to worship him as our greatest desire, then we will experience those tremendous emotions and feelings. And in that case, those emotions actually enhance our worship. But we keep our desire set on the Lord, not on the feelings themselves, because that is what is honoring to him and what absolutely does produce incredible blessings for his people. Blessings like mine with those pastors that we'll never forget. And those are just a hint at the wonder and the beauty of the incredible reality of what it will mean to worship God in his immediate presence, whether in song or in whatever other way, for all eternity to come. And praise the Lord for that, if we would but keep our eyes on him and our desire rooted in him. With this in mind, friends, I pray you have a good and joyful and godly day. And Lord willing, I'll see you soon.